Hello everyone, my name is Josh and this is Whimsical and Interesting Musings, bringing you whimsical and interesting musings every day, all year round. And before I actually start off talking about anything, I just want to tell you why I haven't been, uploading anything for the last few days. It's because I recently had, if you can just tell there, I had my vaccination, my new vaccination, my booster vaccination with the Moderna vaccine, I think it's called. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. It begins with the letter M, and I basically went to go and have that done. Sorry, there was a long pause there. I went to go and have that done at the place where I had my third vaccine, my third Pfizer vaccine. I had two at the Ashford Cafe when it was opening up to do vaccines. I had my two Pfizer vaccines there, and I had my third Pfizer vaccine at the place that I went to this morning to get my Moderna vaccine. And what this vaccine basically is in the short term is it's basically, if you've had the three vaccines, the Pfizer vaccines, this vaccine will essentially give you protection against all variants of COVID. So whenever I'm out and about, I no longer have to worry about, getting any variations of the virus. So I can, I feel fully compensated in the sense that, I have this vaccine. So I'm fully safe and able to, go out and have fun with friends and family members. So I'm much more happier now that I've gotten that vaccine done. But what this vaccine basically does is it just protects you from all other variations of COVID. So now that's been done, I'm much more happier. I feel like I'm fully protected against COVID, and I can now go back to making videos and making regular content. It's all a matter of just trying to figure out what I'm going to do, because sometimes when it's the month of October, it's very hard to talk about, films that you like, because a lot of the stuff that I might cover, often other YouTubers have covered as well, but I'm going to happily cover them anyway, because I feel like these films hold a very special place in my heart, and these bits of media that I'm going to be talking about are very important films and TV shows and things like that to me. So I really do feel like they're perfect for just watching and reviewing it around this time of year. So that was where I was this morning. I got my third jab, my third vaccination jab, and I'm very happy to say that it's going to be my last one until another another vaccine comes out, and to compensate for another variant. But hopefully now this is the last one. So hopefully now I'm fully compensated, and touch wood, this is the last one, and I'm now going to be, talking about the thing that I want to talk about. So sorry if people were wondering where I was for these last couple of days, even though I don't always publish videos, 2 videos a day like I used to do. But it just gives me something of a routine, it gives me something to do, and now that I finally get the chance to do it, I can now do it now. So what I'm going to do now is talk about a book which I think is absolutely incredible. It's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And this book is, to put no finer point on it, it's an absolute classic. It is a novel written by a British author, and her name is Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And she wrote this when she was 18. So she wasn't even fully out of secondary school at the time when this, or fully in further education, when she wrote this book. And this book was pretty much inspired. I think I pretty much covered this in my talk about in another video that I did. But for the most part, this particular book was pretty much the brainchild of Mary after she was invited to a house party by Lord Byron, who is a very well-known poet. And he was kind of well known for being a bit of an anarchist, in the sense that he would do things that weren't of the establishment. He would do things that would kind of, give the finger to authority and just the establishment at large. And he was best friends with Percy Shelley, and he was also a poet in his own right. He did He did poems like, Ozymandias, if you've ever done that for GCSE English. That's a very well-known poem that he did. But then, of course, Byron's did a couple of poems that have been on the GCSE syllabus as well. So he's done a lot of poetry work. But he invited him and his then wife, Mary Shelley, to come up to this house for a stay for a few days. And they were all tasked by Lord Byron himself to come up with a ghost story. And Mary Shelley was kind of knocked for six because she hadn't written anything during the time when she was given this idea. So she was completely out of her element. Like, she was thinking, what am I going to write about? What am I going to talk about? And she had a dream one night where she was visited by a strange apparition. Essentially, it's the scene where Victor is in his bedroom and he wakes up late one night. He's absolutely, absolutely overcome with fever. And he just basically sees the image of the monster and he absolutely just nearly dies of fright. It's incredibly, it's an incredibly iconic scene, and it's been heavily dramatised a lot, but throughout the years in many different adaptations. But what really makes this adaptation really interesting, I'm really close to the camera and I'm really close to the light. Sorry, I'm just going to draw the curtains just so I can, hopefully you guys can see me still if I draw the curtains. So while I do that, this entire book was basically the brainchild of her, Mary Shelley. Oh, nice lighting. And it was her idea, but she came up with the idea, one of which was this dream about this creature coming to her in her sleep and her being absolutely terrified. And one example was of the fact that she visited a university, I think it was a museum or a university lecture hall, where they were experimenting reanimating a toad. And she got the idea through that, the idea of reanimating things. But she didn't want to just make a pulpy horror story. She wanted it to have like a real human heart, like a real human sense of loss and a real sense of longing. So she could have put in her own personal drama when she was a little more than 14 years old. She sadly gave birth to a stillborn child, and sadly the baby died during childbirth. And this heavily affected her. She literally, went into a massive spiral of a depression, and she literally, was inconsolable for days. Her husband literally said, she just wasn't the same after it happened. She literally felt like she was a changed person, and it really affected her really badly. So the fact that was the emotional core of the story of Frankenstein, the idea of that this character, not just this character, but a lot of the characters in the story are plagued with loss and having to deal with the fact that they've lost someone, and it really is a massive theme throughout the majority of the story. But let's get on to the story proper. Let's not talk about the inspiration. But apparently the story was a huge hit, and when she read it, it absolutely, floored people like Lord Byron, who is so, so anti-establishment and so anti-authority. He was literally floored. He literally said, how can a woman write a story like this? And as we all know that, it doesn't matter about gender. It just matters if you're a good storyteller or not. And Mary Shelley was a fantastic storyteller. And she's done a lot of other stuff for fiction. This is her most famous one. It's also known as Modern Prometheus, which is in reference to Greek mythology. I'll go into that later. But for now, she also wrote another story called The Last Man, which is officially the first post-apocalyptic novel. And she was literally one of those people who literally kind of opened the door for science fiction writers. I think that we wouldn't have science fiction writers like Isaac Asimov or Ray Bradbury or even, Richard Matheson, who went on to do the Twilight Zone series, and Rod Serling. We wouldn't have had those types of writers if we hadn't had Mary Shelley, and even Stephen King and various other authors. We wouldn't have had those writers if it wasn't for Mary Shelley. So we have to owe a debt of gratitude. The entire science fiction community should owe a debt of gratitude to Mary Shelley, because she really did kind of open the door for a lot of science fiction writers and science fiction storytellers like George Lucas and like all these other, a lot of science fiction juggle owe a lot to her. And I think that's something that a lot of people really should do. And I think that's incredible. So, without further ado, let's get on to the story proper. So the story basically focuses on a a medical student, who is obsessed with the idea of bringing back dead bodies after a traumatic experience with losing his mother while she's giving birth. And this entire event kind of shapes who he is as a person. But the story begins proper when a character by the name of Robert, who is a explorer, decides to harness a crew and go out in search of the North Pole. And while he's at the North Pole, he pretty much writes back to his sister every once in a while, informing her of his progress and where he's actually going and what's actually happening. But one day, when he's going through the Arctic Alps, he encounters a man who is driven by their dogs, and he basically is inconsolable. He literally is on the verge of death when they meet him. He's very haggard, he's very tired, he's very old, and when we first meet him, he literally is on the verge of he's not conscious at all, but then he is conscious briefly, but then he collapses on board the ship, and then he is very slowly brought back to consciousness, not necessarily health, but consciousness, by Robert and his physicians on board this ship, and he begins to relay this story to Robert, this explorer, about his creation and what went wrong. So that's where the story begins, and the entirety of the story is about Victor creating this creature. Now, the story is written in three very different narratives. That's a very Monty Python thing to do. Say one number when you mean another number. Yeah, it's written in three different narratives, one of which is told from the point of view of Robert, who is writing these letters back to his sister of his progress to find the North Pole and, all these other things. But he also talks about his insecurities and about how his father will see him. And father and son relationships are a very big deal in both the book and the various adaptations of Frankenstein. And I thought that was a very interesting detail to slip in there. And I thought that was very clever of Mary Shelley to do that, because he feels a lot of doubt about his father reacting to these flights of fancy, and he should go to exploring other places that already exist and try not to find places that for all we know existed in myth. So that's one of the things that is the driving force of this particular story. And there's even a line that Victor says at one point to Robert, are you so driven by the attempt of discovery that you will literally not be able to see your own madness when it comes, essentially? And that's very interesting, because it touched on another theme about the dangers of I can't speak. It touches on the dangers of obsession, pretty much, and the idea that sometimes if you get so wrapped up in something, you'll eventually lose yourself, you'll lose your relationships with your family, and you'll lose, various other things as well. You might even lose your life you might get to keep your life if you're lucky, but then again, in this time period that this book is set in, which is the 1800s, is losing your sanity enough? Is losing your sanity, the worst thing? And it is, kind of. It still is the worst thing, because the way they treated people back in the 1800s in lunatic asylums and how they treated mental health in general wasn't really all that good. So you're lucky if you got the chance to keep your life. So yes, that's where the general theming of the book essentially comes from. But the whole entirety, and then we get Victor's story, which is the entirety of his medical school career, him meeting friends, and him, experimenting with dead tissue to finally create this creature. And the third narrative comes to us in the form of the creature himself. And the creature is just called the creature. He's not called Frankenstein, and he isn't called Frankenstein's monster, despite, pop culture pretty much dictating otherwise. And the monster is probably the most interesting character in the entire book for me, even though technically Victor is equally as interesting, and so is Robert and all these other characters as well. But I feel like the monster was the shining star of the show. And again, I saw the original 1930s Boris Karloff version, and that creature, that monster, is so iconic. I even went to a Halloween party with my family dressed as a Frankenstein monster when I was a child. I was that in love with the Frankenstein monster. I was so fascinated by that creation because he has such an iconic look in that film, and it really just kind of, it gives you the chills. But then it also, on repeat viewings, I found myself going, oh, there's actually a lot of really great, wonderful scenes that really give the creature surprising humanity and surprising depth. Like there's that very wonderful scene when you first meet him in the original film, where he literally looks up at the light and he reaches out his hands towards the light. And it's such a beautiful moment, and it really just kind of gives you this moment of, he isn't a monster, and he will only attack you if you attack him back. And that's something that, he's kind of like a bee in that sense, where they won't harm you if you if they're just flying around you. That's not the worst thing. But if they feel like they're being threatened, they will hurt you. And even then, if they hurt you, if they sting you, they're not going to live through it. So that's the really tragic thing about the whole thing, is he doesn't really want to hurt anyone. He just wants to know who he is and why he's here. Why is he given life? Why is he given these answers? And he even calls at one point Victor his Adam when the two confront each other and the two storylines converge. And it's such a fascinating book because for the longest time, the way the book is written, you're led to believe when the creature is created that Victor leaves him in a place where the creature could die or succumb to the ailments and not survive. But as the story goes on, weird things start happening, like his brother William is found strangled in the middle of the forest, and people are actually very concerned. They're wondering what the hell's going on here. And then the housekeeper's daughter, or the kind of, lady's maid, Justine, is accused of the crime because she's found in a barn with an item of the boy's clothing at some point, or a special trinket. And I can't and what really is interesting about this particular moment is that you're led to believe that this stuff is going on. You're wondering, well, what the hell's going on here? Well, of course, when you read the book, you kind of know what's happening. You know that the creature has survived, but at the time, the way it's structured, I'm actually quite surprised that it took that turn, and you kind of think to yourself, oh, it's turned into sort of like this crime story now. It's just turned into this very kind of interesting crime story, and you'll try to figure out, did Justine do this? And she didn't do it. She didn't kill William. It was actually the creature himself. Well, obviously we knew that. But the way it's actually written, it's actually very compellingly done, and I really do applaud Mary Shelley for actually throwing her audience off the scent for a while, and actually actually giving this impression that these things are happening, and it's the fault of this person who just happens to be related to the family. But then he gets a note from his creature saying that he would like to meet in some very quiet place where they won't be disturbed. And it's in the forest, I think, if I remember the book correctly. And he basically tells the story of his survival and how he got to this point. And there's a storyline involving a man and 3 wives or a man and 2 wives trying to basically get married, or it's a couple, and then there's a storyline about a man and 3 marriages, or 2 marriages, or 2 wives, and it really is confusing. But what really is interesting is how the monster absorbs language through these people and through their drama and through their stories, and they absorb. He absorbs human connection. This is one romance that he really gets, invested in, and he gets invested in everyone who comes his way, essentially. But if they were to see him, they wouldn't, treat him any the wiser. But I thought it was very fascinating with the way he kind of absorbed human relationships, and how, that story had a thread about, his father not really approving of his decision making. And the theme about fathers and their sons is a very interesting through line with this particular story, because in the original James Whale film, there is a bit of a conflict between him and his father, and how his father may not approve of his pursuits in medical science and things like that. and of course in the original story, and of course the original story itself pretty much has this idea that essentially Victor and the creature themselves are their own father and son, in a manner of speaking, and the monster feels he was abandoned by his father to pretty much die when he realised that he'd created an abomination. And the book is very compellingly written. I enjoyed the writing style. I loved the plotting as well, because the plot is actually very well structured. And when it does the theory narratives, it could very easily turn into a very confusing mess. But that's only if you jump back and forth. Like some novelists do, especially a lot of crime novelists like Heidi Perks and Lisa Jewell and all these other writers, and even Ruth Rendell will always jump back and forth between all these different perspectives. And it can often get confusing when you do it like that. Sometimes you sometimes have to put, present day or 1995 as of when it was the past or whatever. And sometimes that can get very confusing. But what Mary Shelley does very committedly is she keeps you on this train of narrative thought. And then there's the cut-off point where he's told his story, and then we give way to the next narrative. And then very slowly we start to unravel these two narratives. And then when we get, the only time when we hear from Robert again is at the very end of the story, at the epilogue, where Frankenstein has told his story, and now the rest of the plot can actually, unravel. And that I thought was very compelling, because you very slowly unfolded these stories, but then you're very slowly seeing them wrap up in very equal measure. And Mary Shelley, to her credit, really did a good job of really keeping the stories consistent and on track, to the point where you actually felt like it's not so much a horror story, it's more a story about, but then again, all horror, and I think Frankenstein is a perfect example of why the term elevated horror doesn't work to me, because to me, horror was always elevated. Horror was always a very interesting medium for telling stories and really kind of giving us a window to kind of confront things that we may not feel that comfortable with confronting. And that's something that's really quite incredible. I mean, Jordan Peele has done it recently with Get Out and Us and various other films, and of course Nope recently, which I'm really looking forward to seeing, and The Babadook as well as another example of elevated horror. But to me, I feel like horror has always been a very elevated medium. It doesn't need to have that label on it to really distinct it from to give it that distinction from other horror films, because horror films have always been interesting. They've always had this layer of humanity to them that a lot of people may not, fully recognise or fully appreciate. And Frankenstein is one of those examples, because they could have just turned the Frankenstein's monster into a absolute, goofball bad guy. But what they did is they really gave him a soul, and they really gave him a character that really you could relate to, and you could really feel like, there's a bit of me in the creature, or there's a bit of the outsider in this person, and we can all feel like a bit of an outsider at times, and we can all feel like we're not wanted, or we're not, appreciated, or whatever, and or we feel kind of a little bit different, and that's something that the Frankenstein's monster plays with very well, and it's just so wonderfully captured, and I love everything about the creature. I really think he's a fantastic protagonist. He's a fantastic sympathetic character, because you really do get where he's coming from. You understand what he's actually up to, and it's just really sad seeing this person who is effectively, in the original film version, he is essentially depicted as a child, where he is playing with a little girl, and he's playing with the flower petals, and he's throwing the flower petals into the pond, and he's just smiling. He's got this very goofy smile on his face, and he's just very happy. He's like a big child, essentially, playing with this little girl, and he doesn't realise that he looks at the flower petals, and he looks at the little girl, and he picks her up, and he throws her into the lake, or he throws her into the river, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, no, don't do that, because bless him, he doesn't know that a flower doesn't weigh the same as a human child would. So he kind of has this really horrible misunderstanding, and you just really feel sorry for him, because he clearly was, just having fun with this child, and he actually approaches the child as if she's a person, and he isn't cowering away from her, and he isn't afraid, because adult humans would kind of look at the creature and say, "Oh, you're a monster, you're an abomination, you must die." Whereas the little girl's kind of very curious, and she's like going, "Why are you hiding?" and things like that, and things like that. He actually really does start to, bond with this little girl until this very tragic thing happens, and that gives the character so much more layers. And even though it didn't adapt the novel completely, I felt like it really gave the creature humanity in little small ways. And even though he doesn't articulate thought very well through speech, he does give a lot of humanity, and he does give a lot of perspective on what he's feeling and what he's thinking through just the general grandiose gestures that you see. Because Boris Karloff kind of started his career in the silent films, and in those films, you had to kind of, really kind of go grandiose. You had to go with what, we call in the profession physical theatre, and you had to really kind of expand on your thoughts and your feelings through movements, through gestures. And that's something that Boris Karloff perfected in spades. So when it came round to colour, he could really sell it through his performance, and really could just sell it through his little gestures that he would give. And that's one of the more incredible things about this particular story. But the book is incredibly well thought out. It's an incredibly engaging read. It's beautifully written. And Mary Shelley was one of those writers who literally was a trailblazer in regards to perfecting the mould of science fiction as we know it. Because a lot of people credit Stephen King, and even though I love Stephen King, he's one of my favourite authors, I feel like not many people give enough credit to Mary Shelley, because people don't often think of Frankenstein as a science fiction story. They think of it as a horror story, and rightly so. It is a horror story, but it's also a story that could have created another genre in its own right, and I think Mary Shelley should be given credit where it's due. So I think this book deserves a 5 out of 5 stars. It's a fantastic, fantastic read. It's one of those books where I happily, a couple of Halloweens back, before, I think it was during the first pandemic, I actually got the chance to read this along with another book. I brought it on holiday with me to this caravan site in Camber Sands, and me and my cousins, me and my family, my mum, my dad, my 2 sisters, my nieces and nephews, and my brothers-in-law, and my cousins, and all sorts of people just came with us. We all decided to have this big, gathering together after the pandemic, because we hadn't seen each other for ages. We'd all been in lockdown. And one of the books I brought with me was Frankenstein. And I'd seen the original 1930s film with Boris Karloff. It's one of my favourites. And I saw the film adaptation Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, starring Robert De Niro and directed by Kenneth Branagh. And both are absolutely amazing. Robert De Niro as the monster is incredibly rich and textured. And I feel like a lot of people don't often give Robert De Niro credit for starring in roles like this, but I think when you get the chance to play the monster as an actor, the creature, the Frankenstein's monster, that's on par with getting the chance to play a Shakespeare character. That's literally the highest honour you can get as an actor, I think, in my opinion. And Robert De Niro did it flawlessly. He absolutely did his own version of the character, and he really did kind of try to give it so much depth and so much understanding, because he's just such a good bloody actor, and I think he's amazing. And I actually got the opportunity to read the book finally, and I couldn't put it down. There were moments where I was literally in my caravan watching horror movies on the horror channel during the Halloween time as I was in this caravan in Camber Sands, and I was reading this book and I was so engrossed, and I absolutely loved the writing style. I loved the characters, and I completely utterly have a tremendous respect for this novel, and I really do think more people should read it and more people should give this story go. And I'd highly recommend as well people check out Mary Shelley's other books, because I feel like even though this is one of her masterpiece, I feel like people should read The Immortal Immortal, and which is a short story of hers, and The Last Man as well, because they're both incredibly well written, and she really did kind of pioneer a lot of the science fiction genre, even though people do think of Frankenstein as a horror story. But I would highly recommend this. It's a 5 out of 5 star book, and this has been Josh with Whimsical and Interesting Musings, and have a great day. Bye-bye for now. Take care, everyone. Bye.